Imagine a congressional hearing that never officially happened, but easily could have. A constitutional stress test conducted not in history books but in the raw, fluorescent-lit reality of a House committee room. Imagine it framed not as accusation or verdict, but as a what-if reckoning. A hypothetical confrontation designed to expose how power behaves when it believes itself righteous. In this imagined moment, two men sit across from each other, each carrying a very different relationship to the Constitution they both claim to defend. Speaker Mike Johnson and Congressman Jamie Raskin. Jamie Raskin enters the room first in this scenario, confident, practiced, comfortable in the choreography of Washington authority. He is a constitutional law professor by training, a veteran legislator by instinct, a man whose voice has narrated national trauma with certainty for years. Cameras recognize him. Reporters anticipate him. His posture signals command, not hostility but ownership, the assurance of someone accustomed to defining the frame before anyone else speaks. This hearing, in his mind, is not a trial. It is a reaffirmation. Mike Johnson arrives with less noise and fewer assumptions attached to his presence. In this imagined setting, he is newer to the speaker's gavel, quieter in demeanor, still underestimated by those who equate seriousness with theatricality. He carries no entourage into the room, no stack of talking points prepared for cable news. He carries only what he needs, and perhaps what others dismiss. The contrast between the two men is immediate, and it is not accidental. It is the tension upon which the entire hypothetical rests. The hearing opens with the expected rhythms. Raskin speaks first, framing the stakes in familiar moral language. He talks about democracy under threat, about extraordinary times demanding extraordinary measures, about the necessity of decisive congressional action in the face of unprecedented danger. January 6th is invoked not as a question, but as a settled conclusion, an established moral verdict rather than a contested constitutional problem. The room listens, nods, recognizes the cadence. This is a man fluent in the language of urgency. Johnson listens without interruption. In this imagined moment, he does not dispute the seriousness of the event, does not minimize the fear or the chaos that Americans watched unfold. Instead, when his turn comes, he does something unexpected. He asks a narrow question, almost modest in scope, the kind of question that seems procedural until it isn't. He asks whether Congress, even under extraordinary pressure, remains bound by constitutional restraint. Raskin answers easily. Of course it does, he says. But context matters. Emergencies require flexibility. Norms cannot become shackles. It is a reasonable answer. It is also the hinge on which the door opens. Because Johnson does not argue about intentions. He argues about authority. He does not question whether Raskin believed he was defending democracy. He asks whether belief itself grants permission. Permission to combine roles. Permission to select evidence. Permission to decide in advance what truth must look like in order to be acceptable. The shift is subtle but decisive. The hearing begins to feel less like a platform and more like an examination. In this hypothetical exchange, Johnson reframes the conversation away from morality and toward mechanics. He asks whether a congressional committee can function simultaneously as investigator, prosecutor, and narrator without eroding the separation of powers. He asks whether reputational punishment without formal adjudication can coexist with due process. He asks whether public certainty that precedes private verification strengthens democracy or weakens it. These are not accusations. They are structural questions, and structures, unlike people, cannot plead good faith. Raskin grows sharper now, not angry but defensive in the way experts become when their domain is challenged. He emphasizes that congressional investigations are not criminal trials, that their purpose is oversight, not prosecution. Johnson agrees. Then he asks why the committee behaved like a trial anyway, why witnesses were treated as instruments of narrative rather than sources of uncertainty, why conclusions were announced before records were closed, why the minority's access was constrained in ways previous investigations had avoided. The room, in this imagined hearing, grows quieter. Not because minds are changing, but because the familiar script is no longer working. Johnson does not raise his voice. He does not accuse Raskin of malice. Instead, he describes temptation, the temptation to believe that righteousness authorizes shortcuts, the temptation to treat dissent as danger and procedure as delay, the temptation to believe that defending democracy allows one to suspend its safeguards. This is where the hypothetical deepens. Johnson asks what happens to a constitutional system when certainty replaces humility, when the outcome becomes more important than the process that leads to it, when evidence that complicates the story is treated not as information, but as obstruction. He does not claim this happened. He asks what would happen if it did. And in that conditional space, the room begins to understand the stakes. Raskin responds by invoking history, by reminding the committee of the consequences of inaction, of the dangers of false equivalence. He frames restraint as weakness and skepticism as complicity. The argument is emotionally compelling, and that is precisely why Johnson does not meet it on emotional ground. He meets it with the Constitution itself, not as symbolism, but as architecture. He speaks of Article 1 not as text to be admired, but as a boundary to be respected. Power, he suggests, is most dangerous when it is convinced of its own virtue. In this imagined hearing, the audience begins to sense something unsettling. That constitutional collapse does not require villains, only convinced people operating without restraint. That good intentions, when paired with unchecked authority, can produce outcomes indistinguishable from abuse. That the line between oversight and overreach is thinner than anyone wants to admit, and easier to cross when the crowd is cheering. Johnson does not claim that Raskin crossed that line. He asks how anyone can be sure they did not. He asks what safeguards exist to prevent a committee from becoming judge and jury. He asks who watches the watchers when urgency becomes justification. The questions hang in the air, unanswered, and that silence is the most powerful moment of the hypothetical. By the end of this first movement, no files have been opened, no witnesses called, no evidence introduced. And yet something fundamental has shifted. The hearing has ceased to be about one event and has become about a system, about whether constitutional norms are resilient enough to survive moral certainty, about whether power can restrain itself when it believes history is watching. Raskin remains composed, but less certain now, aware that the ground beneath the conversation has moved. Johnson remains calm, aware that he has not accused anyone of wrongdoing, only exposed the fragility of the assumptions that protect wrongdoing when it occurs. The room adjourns not with outrage or applause, but with unease. And unease, in constitutional systems, is often the first sign that accountability may still be possible. This is only the beginning of the hypothetical. The reckoning, if it continues, will not be kind to certainty, and it will not reward confidence unsupported by restraint. The second movement of this hypothetical reckoning begins where certainty first starts to crack, not with accusations, but with procedure. the quiet machinery of power that most people never see and few fully understand. In this imagined hearing, Mike Johnson does not escalate rhetorically. He narrows the frame. He asks Jamie Raskin to walk with him, slowly, through how authority was exercised, not why. The shift is subtle, but devastating, because motives can be defended while mechanisms cannot. Johnson asks Raskin to describe the structure of the committee as it actually functioned, not as it was publicly presented. Who decided which witnesses testified in open session and which remained sealed? Who controlled access to raw transcripts? Who determined when testimony became evidence and when it became narrative? Raskin answers confidently at first, explaining that leadership decisions are inherent in any investigation, that order and coherence are necessary to prevent chaos. Johnson listens, nods, and then asks whether coherence is the same thing as completeness. In this imagined exchange, Johnson introduces a question that seems almost academic until it lands. He asks whether a congressional investigation owes fairness not only to the public, but to the people it scrutinizes. Raskin responds that Congress is not a court, that its duty is to uncover facts, not adjudicate guilt. Johnson agrees again, and then asks why the committee repeatedly spoke in the language of verdicts. Why press conferences preceded internal deliberations? Why conclusions were announced before minority members had full access to records? The room grows quieter as the logic tightens. Johnson is not accusing Raskin of lying. He is asking whether the committee's design allowed alternative interpretations to survive. He asks whether dissenting views were treated as information or obstruction, whether uncertainty was documented or edited out, whether process was respected when it slowed momentum. These questions do not sound like attacks, but they feel like exposure, because they reveal the scaffolding behind public confidence. Raskin begins to push back harder now, insisting that the magnitude of the event justified an assertive posture. He speaks of the danger of paralysis, of bad actors exploiting delay, of the need to send a clear message to protect democratic norms. Johnson does not dispute the desire for clarity. He asks whether clarity achieved by exclusion is clarity at all. He asks whether democracy is strengthened by speed or by legitimacy. The distinction matters, and it lingers. In this hypothetical, Johnson introduces precedent not as history, but as constraint. He references prior congressional investigations, not by name, but by structure. Bipartisan subpoena authority, shared access to evidence, minority rights designed not to obstruct, but to prevent abuse. He asks whether those safeguards were viewed as outdated formalities or essential protections. Raskin hesitates before answering, and the hesitation is visible even without words. The conversation turns to transparency, the word that dominates modern oversight rhetoric. Johnson asks what transparency means when information flows outward selectively but inward restrictively. When the public sees curated excerpts while full records remain inaccessible. When press briefings precede internal review. Transparency, he suggests, becomes performative when it is unidirectional. Raskin objects, arguing that responsible disclosure requires judgment. Johnson does not disagree. He asks who exercises that judgment, and under what accountability. In this imagined hearing, the most unsettling moment arrives not with evidence, but with inversion. Johnson asks Raskin to imagine himself on the other side of the table, to imagine being the subject of an investigation that combines secrecy, selective disclosure, and public moral condemnation, to imagine having no meaningful ability to challenge context, confront witnesses, or correct the record before reputational damage becomes irreversible. The room holds its breath, because imagination, once invited, cannot be controlled. Raskin responds that the comparison is unfair, that the stakes justified extraordinary vigilance. Johnson acknowledges the stakes and then asks whether constitutional systems are designed for easy cases or hard ones. He asks whether safeguards exist for moments of calm or moments of fear. The implication is clear without being spoken. If the Constitution bends most when it is most needed, then its strength is illusory. The hearing, still hypothetical, begins to feel less like an argument and more like an autopsy of power. Johnson speaks of concentration, of how authority accumulates when urgency overrides restraint. He speaks of narrative gravity, how once a story gains momentum, evidence is judged by its usefulness rather than its accuracy. He speaks of institutional self-justification, how committees come to defend their conclusions as proxies for defending democracy itself. Raskin grows visibly uncomfortable now, not because he lacks answers, but because the answers no longer resolve the questions. He insists that history will judge the committee favorably. Johnson replies that history judges outcomes, but the Constitution judges methods. He asks whether history's approval absolves constitutional violation. The question is rhetorical, but its weight is real. In this imagined moment, Johnson introduces the concept of due process not as a legal technicality, but as a moral discipline. Due process, he suggests, is the humility built into power, the acknowledgement that certainty is dangerous when unchecked. He asks whether the committee ever doubted itself, and if so, where that doubt is recorded. Silence answers the question better than words. The audience, in this scenario, begins to sense that something irreversible has happened. The hearing is no longer about defending an investigation. It is about defending the idea that process matters even when outcomes feel justified. That restraint is not weakness, that constitutional limits exist precisely to protect against the seduction of moral certainty. Johnson does not preach this. He demonstrates it by refusing to accuse while still refusing to absolve. As the session draws toward a pause, Johnson makes his final move of this act. He asks whether Congress can claim to defend democracy while operating in ways that deny those it scrutinizes the protections democracy promises. He does not wait for an answer. He lets the question sit, unanswered, uncomfortably alive. Raskin looks down, not defeated, but unsettled, aware that the terrain has shifted beneath him. The gavel signals a recess in this hypothetical hearing, but no one moves immediately. The room remains suspended in the awareness that something foundational has been challenged. Not a person, not a party, but a belief. That noble ends excuse compromised means. As people begin to stand, the unease lingers because the reckoning has not yet reached its sharpest edge. And everyone in the room senses that when it does, procedure will no longer be an abstraction, but a verdict waiting to happen. The third movement of this hypothetical reckoning begins after the recess, when the room reconvenes with the quiet awareness that abstraction is no longer sufficient. Procedure has been examined, structure questioned, authority narrowed. Now comes the moment when theory meets consequence, when the hypothetical shifts from architecture to human cost. Mike Johnson does not announce this shift. He allows it to happen by changing what he asks Jamie Raskin to confront. In this imagined continuation, Johnson begins not with documents, but with people. He asks Raskin whether congressional investigations have an ethical obligation to consider the downstream effects of their actions, not only on institutions, but on individuals. Raskin answers carefully, affirming concern for civil liberties, while reiterating the necessity of accountability. Johnson nods, then asks a question that tightens the room. What happens, he asks, when an investigation designed to protect democracy produces irreversible harm to people who never receive a meaningful chance to defend themselves. The hearing grows quieter as Johnson elaborates. He speaks hypothetically of witnesses whose words were taken out of sequence, of testimony distilled into sound bites that carried certainty but lost context. He speaks of individuals named publicly in reports, described as central actors, without ever being charged or afforded formal process. He does not claim this occurred in any specific case. He asks what would happen if it did, and whether Congress has contemplated safeguards against that outcome. Raskin responds that public accountability sometimes requires naming conduct, even absent prosecution, that sunlight itself is a disinfectant. Johnson agrees, then asks whether sunlight that is selectively filtered still disinfects, or whether it blinds. He asks whether reputational punishment without adjudication is compatible with constitutional fairness. The question is not rhetorical. It demands an answer that cannot rely on moral certainty alone. In this hypothetical exchange, Johnson introduces the concept of exculpatory information, not as a legal mandate, but as an ethical obligation. He asks whether an investigation owes the public not just compelling evidence, but contradictory evidence as well. Whether democracy is served by a narrative that excludes ambiguity. Raskin answers that committees must exercise judgment in what they present. Johnson asks whether judgment that consistently excludes doubt is judgment at all. The tension sharpens. Johnson begins to outline, still hypothetically, what happens when evidence is curated rather than preserved. When raw material is transformed into narrative before independent scrutiny can occur. When classification and redaction are used not only for security, but for coherence. He asks whether future oversight bodies would be able to reconstruct the full record, or whether history would inherit only the version deemed acceptable at the time. Raskin pushes back, insisting that such hypotheticals assume bad faith. Johnson does not accept the premise. He argues that constitutional safeguards exist precisely because good faith cannot be guaranteed under pressure. He reminds the room that the framers did not design protections for villains, but for well-intentioned people convinced of their righteousness. That reminder lands heavily, because it reframes the entire discussion away from character and toward restraint. The imagined hearing takes a darker turn when Johnson addresses witness dynamics. He speaks carefully, choosing his words as if weighing each one. What if, he asks, witnesses felt pressure not to contradict the dominant narrative? What if cooperation were rewarded with validation and dissent met with suspicion? What if the line between encouragement and coercion blurred under the weight of expectation? He does not allege. He asks whether such a scenario is conceivable in an environment saturated with moral urgency. Raskin denies that any such pressure would be tolerated. Johnson accepts the denial, then asks how one would know if it occurred. Were there mechanisms for witnesses to report discomfort without consequence? Were there records of internal disagreement preserved? Were deviations from expected testimony documented or erased? The questions accumulate, each one narrowing the space for reassurance. In this hypothetical, Johnson introduces a crucial distinction. Accountability, he suggests, is not measured by how forcefully one pursues a conclusion, but by how one treats information that threatens it. He asks whether the committee ever paused to reconsider its assumptions, whether contrary evidence prompted revision or resistance, whether uncertainty was viewed as weakness or as fidelity to truth. The room feels the weight of the inquiry, because the answers are no longer about policy, but about humility. Raskin grows more guarded now, his responses shorter, his tone more legalistic. He emphasizes that Congress must sometimes act decisively to preserve democratic norms. Johnson does not dispute decisiveness. He asks whether decisiveness that forecloses correction is compatible with constitutional governance. He asks whether democracy survives not because of strong conclusions, but because of reversible ones. The imagined hearing reaches its most unsettling phase when Johnson speaks of precedent. Not the precedent of past investigations, but the precedent set for future ones. He asks what message is sent when Congress demonstrates that urgency can override restraint, when narrative success is rewarded more than procedural integrity, when the lesson learned is not how to investigate carefully, but how to control the story effectively. The implication is unavoidable. Tomorrow's abuses will justify themselves using today's rationale. Raskin attempts to reassert moral ground, invoking the danger of normalizing delay and equivocation. Johnson responds by reframing delay not as paralysis, but as protection. Protection against error. Protection against abuse. Protection against the irreversible consequences of being wrong with confidence. He asks whether the committee considered the possibility of error at all, and if so, how that possibility was mitigated. The audience, in this scenario, begins to sense that the reckoning has moved beyond defense. It is now about accountability to first principles. Johnson speaks of due process as the discipline of power, the practice that forces authority to slow down long enough to listen. He asks whether the committee ever slowed itself, whether momentum became its own justification, whether dissent was recorded or erased. Raskin does not collapse under the questioning, but he does not dominate it either. His certainty has been replaced by caution, his confidence by calculation. The room observes the shift without comment. Johnson does not exploit it. He allows it to exist, because the purpose of this hypothetical is not humiliation, but exposure. As the third movement draws toward its end, Johnson poses a final question of this act, one that hangs heavier than all the others. If Congress cannot restrain itself when it believes democracy is at risk, he asks, then who restrains Congress? The Constitution, he suggests, does not enforce itself. It relies on those in power to honor its limits, even when doing so it is inconvenient, especially then. The gavel signals another pause, but the room does not relax. The atmosphere has changed irreversibly. The hypothetical has crossed from intellectual exercise into moral confrontation. No accusations have been leveled, no verdicts announced. And yet everyone present understands that the final movement will not be about what could have happened, but about what must never be allowed to happen again. The fourth and final movement of this hypothetical reckoning begins without drama, because by now drama is unnecessary. The room understands that it has crossed from inquiry into consequence, from what might have happened into what must be prevented. Mike Johnson does not escalate his tone. He lowers it. In constitutional confrontations, the most dangerous moments are rarely loud. They are quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. Johnson begins this imagined closing not by addressing Jamie Raskin directly, but by addressing the idea that has hovered over the entire hearing without being named. The idea that constitutional guardrails are negotiable when the stakes feel high enough. He speaks of power not as something seized, but as something slowly normalized. Not as a coup, but as a habit. He suggests that the greatest threat to constitutional order is not rebellion, but certainty. The belief that one's cause is so just that limits become optional. Raskin listens carefully now, no longer interrupting, no longer framing. He understands that this is not about defending a committee or an investigation. It is about defending a philosophy of governance. Johnson articulates that philosophy plainly. The Constitution, he says, does not trust intentions. It distrusts concentration. It assumes that even well-meaning people will overreach, if unrestrained. That is why it divides power, slows process, and protects dissent. Not because it expects malice, but because it anticipates temptation. In this imagined moment, Johnson asks Raskin a question that carries the weight of the entire reckoning. He asks whether there is any emergency so severe that Congress should be allowed to abandon its own safeguards. Raskin answers carefully, acknowledging limits, insisting that no one is above the Constitution. Johnson accepts the answer and then asks the harder question. If no one is above it, then who decides when its protections can be suspended? The silence that follows is not hostile. It is contemplative. Johnson continues, speaking now not as speaker, but as a custodian of institutional memory. He reminds the room that constitutional erosion rarely announces itself. It arrives dressed as necessity. It justifies itself as temporary. It promises to restore norms once the danger has passed. History, he suggests, is filled with moments where those promises were sincere and still catastrophic. The lesson is not that people are evil, but that power is persuasive. The hypothetical turns inward. Johnson asks whether the committee ever paused to ask what precedent it was setting. Not for this moment, but for the next one. For the moment when a different majority, a different crisis, a different moral certainty invokes the same rationale. He asks whether anyone considered how easily today's justification could become tomorrow's excuse. The room feels the implication without needing it spelled out. Raskin responds that democracy sometimes requires bold action to defend itself. Johnson does not dispute boldness. He disputes abandonment. He draws a distinction between defending democracy and redefining it, between protecting institutions and reshaping them to fit urgency. He suggests that when Congress assumes the authority to bypass fairness in the name of protection, it teaches future actors that protection is a sufficient excuse for overreach. In this final act, Johnson addresses the audience beyond the room. He speaks hypothetically to the public, to future lawmakers, to citizens who may one day watch another hearing like this unfold. He asks what they would want in that moment. Would they want speed or legitimacy? Would they want certainty or fairness? Would they trust conclusions reached without challenge? The questions are not rhetorical. They are invitations to responsibility. The imagined hearing reaches its most sobering point when Johnson articulates the cost of being wrong. Not politically wrong, but constitutionally wrong. He speaks of reputations destroyed without trial, of narratives hardened before correction, of institutions weakened not by attack, but by overconfidence. He does not claim these outcomes occurred. He asks whether the system is designed to prevent them if they ever do. Raskin, in this scenario, offers a final defense grounded not in procedure, but in moral urgency. He warns of complacency, of underreaction, of the dangers of hesitation. Johnson listens, then responds with restraint. He agrees that complacency is dangerous. He argues that so is certainty, that the Constitution was written not to empower the righteous, but to restrain everyone, especially the righteous. As the hypothetical draws toward its close, Johnson reframes the entire reckoning in a single principle. Democracy, he suggests, is not preserved by those who believe they are right, but by those willing to be checked, not by those who move fastest, but by those who refuse to move alone, not by those who control the narrative, but by those who protect the process, even when it complicates the narrative. The room senses that there will be no verdict today, no winner declared, no decisive moment for headlines. And yet, the weight of the exchange is undeniable. Something has been tested. Something has been exposed. The belief that noble ends automatically justify compromised means has been challenged, not with accusation, but with architecture. Johnson concludes this imagined reckoning by returning to first principles. He reminds the room that the Constitution does not promise perfect outcomes. It promises fair ones. It does not guarantee safety. It guarantees limits. And those limits, he suggests, are not obstacles to democracy, but its foundation. When they are treated as optional, democracy does not collapse immediately. It erodes quietly, one justified exception at a time. The gavel falls for the final time in this hypothetical hearing. People rise slowly, aware that they have not witnessed a resolution, but a confrontation with discomfort. Raskin gathers his papers, thoughtful rather than defeated. Johnson closes his folder, having offered no accusations and demanded no confessions. The reckoning remains unfinished, as all constitutional reckonings must. And as the room empties, one question lingers, unanswered and unavoidable, directed not at any single man, but at everyone who believes power can be trusted with certainty. If the Constitution is only respected when it is convenient, then when it becomes inconvenient again, who will be left to defend it?